I worked the night shift at a 911 dispatch center. My predecessor left a sticky note with one strict rule, and yesterday I broke it. I worked the graveyard shift at a central emergency dispatch center for a major area. The hours between midnight and 6 in the morning do something terrible to the human mind. The rest of the world goes to sleep, and you are left sitting in a dark, heavily air-conditioned room, staring at a bank of glowing monitors, listening to the worst moments of people's lives. You deal with drunk drivers, domestic disputes, medical emergencies, and the deeply lonely people who just want to hear a voice in the dark. You learn to detach yourself and to follow the strict protocols established by the city. My training was brief. The supervisor handed me a thick binder of codes, showed me how to log into the routing software, and pointed me to a desk in the back corner of the room. The dispatcher who worked this specific desk before me had quit without giving any notice. He simply walked out in the middle of a Tuesday night shift and never came back. No one in the office liked to talk about him. When I sat down at the desk for the first time, I found a small yellow sticky note pressed firmly onto the lower bezel of the primary monitor. The handwriting was frantic, the letters pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through. The note contained a single, highly specific rule. If a caller speaks an undocumented, clicking dialect and asks for a translator, transfer them to line 9 and hang up immediately. I stared at the note for a long time. Dispatch centers receive calls from people speaking hundreds of different languages. We have an entire department dedicated to rapid translation services. We patch the calls through to the language line, a translator joins the channel, and we coordinate the emergency response. Transferring a desperate caller to a dead line and terminating the connection goes against every single ethical and professional regulation in the manual. I assumed the note was a dark, twisted joke left by an employee who had burned out from the stress of the job. I peeled the sticky note off the monitor and tossed it into the trash can under my desk. I worked the desk for 3 weeks without incident. The calls were routine. I drank terrible coffee, routed ambulances, and watched the clock slowly tick toward morning. The call came in on a Thursday night at exactly 3 in the morning. The digital console beeped sharply, indicating an incoming connection from a mobile device. I pressed the button on my headset to accept the call. 911, what is your emergency? I said, pulling up the blank entry form on my keyboard. The line was completely silent for a moment. There was no heavy breathing, no background traffic, no wind. The audio feed sounded incredibly sterile. Then, the clicking started. It was a rapid, rhythmic sequence of hard, wet sounds. It sounded exactly like the wet tissue of a tongue striking the back of a pallet, mixed with the sharp scraping of stones rubbing together. The clicks varied in pitch and speed, forming a complex, structured cadence that clearly functioned as a spoken language. I had handled calls involving rare dialects before, but this audio profile was entirely alien. It made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice steady. "I cannot understand you. Do you need police, fire, or medical assistance?" The clicking paused. A deep, heavily distorted voice spoke through the static. The voice sounded incredibly unnatural, as if multiple vocal cords were vibrating simultaneously to produce the English words. "Translator," the voice rasped, the syllables dragging across the connection. "We need a translator." A sharp jolt of adrenaline flooded my chest. I immediately remembered the crumpled yellow sticky note sitting at the bottom of my trash can. I moved my mouse across the screen, hovering the cursor over the manual transfer directory. I located line 9. My finger rested on the left mouse button. I was entirely prepared to click the transfer protocol and end the call. Before I could press the button, a new sound bled through the audio feed. It was a child, a young boy, crying softly in the background. His voice was incredibly clear, completely lacking the distortion of the primary caller. "Please," the child sobbed, his voice trembling with genuine terror. "Please help us. He is hurting my mom. I want to go home." My hand froze over the mouse. The professional detachment I relied on to survive the job completely evaporated. You cannot ignore a child in danger. I pulled my hand away from the mouse and brought my fingers to the keyboard. "I hear you," I said urgently, typing a command to force the routing software to ping the nearest cellular tower. "I am staying on the line. Can you tell me where you are?" The child did not answer. The deep, distorted voice returned to the channel, completely speaking over the crying boy. "You stayed," the voice whispered. The clicking sounds erupted again, significantly louder and more aggressive this time, drowning out the background noise entirely. The wet, scraping blasted through my headset, vibrating painfully against my eardrums. I stared at the location software on my primary monitor. The map was attempting to lock onto the signal, but the tracking radius was completely malfunctioning. The red perimeter circle bounced wildly across the city grid, stretching from the downtown all the way to the borders, entirely unable to pinpoint a stable coordinate. "Sir, you need to tell me your location," I demanded, ignoring the painful clicking sounds. "I am dispatching units, but I need an address." The static on the line spiked violently, producing a sharp, deafening screech of audio feedback. I ripped the headset off my ears, throwing it onto the desk. The call abruptly disconnected, and the timer on my screen reset to 0. I sat back in my chair, rubbing my temples. I tried to pull the archived call data to force a manual location trace, but the system registered the interaction as a corrupted file. There was no phone number attached to the record. There was no digital footprint. It was as if the call had never actually occurred within the routing software. I finished the remainder of my shift in a state of profound, lingering unease. I kept staring at the blank screen, waiting for the phone to ring again. But the console remained quiet. When 6 o'clock finally arrived, I gathered my belongings, clocked out of the system, and walked to my car in the empty parking lot. The environment of my daily life began to severely deteriorate that same evening. I live alone in a small, ground-floor apartment on the outskirts of the city. I went home, locked the deadbolts, and tried to sleep to prepare for my next night shift. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, completely unable to settle my mind. The exhaustion weighed on my muscles, but my brain refused to power down. At roughly 2 in the afternoon, the ambient noise in my bedroom completely shifted. The low hum of the air conditioning unit pushing air through the ceiling vents stopped. The distant sound of traffic rolling down the avenue outside my window faded entirely into silence. A sharp, wet sound echoed from the dark hallway outside my bedroom door. It was the clicking, the exact same rapid sequence of scraping stones and wet tissue I had heard through the headset at the dispatch center. But it came from inside my home. I sat up slowly, pushing the blankets off my chest. I reached out to the bedside table and grabbed the flashlight I kept in the drawer. I engaged the beam, aiming the bright circle of light directly toward the open bedroom door. The hallway was filled with thick, unnatural shadows that seemed to actively resist the illumination of the flashlight. Something was shifting along the wall just outside my vision. I gripped the flashlight tightly and took a slow step toward the door. I aimed the beam directly into the center of the dark corridor. The thing occupying my hallway completely defied any logical biological structure. It was a massive, chaotic amalgamation of human anatomy and debris, crawling slowly across the hardwood floorboards. The body of the it consisted entirely of dozens of severed, heavily bruised human limbs. Arms and legs were brutally fused together in a shifting, rolling mass of rotting, discolored flesh. The limbs articulated randomly, dragging the heavy center of the thing forward with jerky, uncoordinated movements. Wrapped aggressively around the bruised limbs, binding the horrific anatomy together, were hundreds of yards of thick, unspooled copper telephone wire. The frayed, rusted copper dug deeply into the flesh, creating deep lacerations that wept a dark, thick fluid onto my floorboards. Spread randomly across the shifting mass of limbs were multiple human mouths. They completely lacked any supporting facial features. They were simply torn, ragged lips and teeth embedded directly into the bruised skin. Every single mouth was opening and closing in perfect unison, producing the deafening, rapid clicking dialect. I stood completely paralyzed in the bedroom doorway, my mind aggressively rejecting what I am seeing. The creature slowly oriented its massive, rolling bulk directly toward my position. The copper wires scraped violently against the floorboards as it pulled itself forward. My survival instinct finally shattered the paralysis. I threw the flashlight directly at the shifting mass of limbs. The cylinder struck the creature, producing a sharp, wet thud, and rolled away into the dark. I turned around, sprinted blindly toward the bedroom window, unlatched the glass pane, and threw myself completely out of the ground floor opening. I hit the landscaping bushes outside, scrambled frantically to my feet, and ran down the street until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to collapse. I spent the rest of the day sitting in the back corner of a crowded diner, drinking endless cups of black coffee, entirely terrified to return to my apartment. I knew I could not simply run away. That thing was tied to the call I stayed in. I needed to understand what happened, and what is the meaning of that call and the note. I waited until the sun went down and drove my car back to the dispatch center. I used my employee access card to enter the building before my shift began. The room was mostly empty during the shift changeover. I sat at my desk, bypassed the standard routing software, and dug into the raw diagnostic data of the server archives. I pulled the corrupted file from the previous night. I ran a manual decryption protocol, stripping away the audio files to isolate the raw geographical data points the tower had attempted to lock onto before the system crashed. The software spit out a single, heavily fragmented set of coordinates. The location was situated deep within the abandoned industrial sector on the extreme eastern edge of the city. It was an area completely devoid of residential housing or active commercial businesses. I printed the coordinates, locked my workstation, and walked back out to my car. I retrieved a heavy tire iron from the trunk, placed it securely on the passenger seat, and drove toward the eastern sector. I followed the GPS coordinates on my phone until I reached a dead end at the edge of a massive, sprawling complex. The faded, rusted metal sign hanging precariously over the main loading dock indicated the building was formerly a meatpacking plant. The structure was immense, easily spanning an entire city block, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with coils of rusted razor wire. I parked my car in an overgrown alleyway, grabbed the tire iron, and approached the perimeter fence. I found a section where the chain link had been violently peeled back, creating a narrow gap large enough to crawl through. I slipped through the gap and walked across the cracked concrete of the loading dock. The steel roll-up doors were secured with thick chains, but a small pedestrian access door located on the side of the building was slightly ajar. I pulled the door open, the rusted hinges screaming loudly in the quiet night, and stepped inside the plant. I engaged the flashlight on my phone, sweeping the weak beam across the cavernous space. The main processing floor was massive. Hundreds of heavy steel meat hooks hung from an intricate network of rusted rails bolted to the ceiling. The hooks swung slightly in the draft, clinking together with a metallic chime. I walked slowly across the processing floor, keeping my grip tight on the tire iron. The space was completely hollowed out, stripped of any valuable machinery by decades of scavengers. I navigated through a maze of empty cold storage lockers and narrow blood-stained corridors. As I reached the far end of the facility, pushing through a heavy set of swinging rubber doors, my flashlight beam illuminated a structure that completely defied the abandoned nature of the plant. Built directly into the center of a massive, empty storage locker was a small, self-contained room constructed from heavy cinder blocks. The steel door securing the room was pristine, lacking any rust, and locked with a heavy, modern brass padlock. Someone was actively using this room. I stepped up to the steel door, wedged the flat edge of the tire iron directly beneath the brass padlock, and applied my entire body weight to the metal bar. The locking mechanism fought back for a moment before the metal casing violently snapped, dropping the broken padlock onto the floor. I pulled the door open and stepped into the hidden room. The space was relatively small, heavily insulated with thick layers of acoustic foam bolted to the cinder block walls. A single, bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh, yellow glare across the room. The contents of the room forced the air completely out of my lungs. Positioned in the corner of the room was a large plastic bin. The bin was overflowing with hundreds of personal documents. I walked over and pulled a handful of the papers from the pile. They were foreign passports, temporary work visas, and international identification cards. The documents belonged to people from dozens of different countries. I looked closely at the photographs printed on the identification cards. A profound, sickening wave of recognition washed over me. I had seen these faces before. They were the faces of undocumented immigrants who had vanished entirely from the city over the past decade. The local news stations constantly ran stories about missing day laborers, construction workers, and cleaning staff who simply disappeared without a trace, leaving their desperate families begging for answers. Resting on a wooden desk next to the plastic bin were neat, organized stacks of folded clothing. The garments were heavily stained with large, dark patches of dried blood. Sitting on the opposite end of the wooden desk was a small, boxy television set connected to a dusty DVD player and a VCR. Stacked neatly next to the electronics were dozens of unmarked VH tapes. I set the tire iron down on the desk, reached out with trembling hands, and grabbed the tape sitting at the top of the stack. I pushed the plastic cassette into the VCR and pressed the play button on the front console. The television screen flared with white static before stabilizing into a grainy, low-resolution video feed. The camera was mounted on a tripod, recording a scene taking place inside this exact cinderblock room. Sitting comfortably in a folding metal chair in the center of the frame was a man. He appeared to be in his late 60s, possessing short, neatly trimmed gray hair and a stern, weathered face. He was wearing a dark, highly formal uniform adorned with brass buttons and official patches. Lying on the floor directly behind his chair was a young woman. Her wrists and ankles were bound tightly with thick plastic zip ties. She was weeping violently, her shoulders shaking as she struggled uselessly against the bindings. The man in the uniform ignored the sobbing woman completely. He looked directly into the camera lens, his expression entirely calm and devoid of any human empathy. "The system is entirely broken," the man spoke, his voice deep, authoritative, and chillingly articulate. "The politicians open the gates and allow the colored filth to flood our streets. They dilute the purity of our nation. They drain our resources and pollute our neighborhoods. The official channels refuse to take the necessary action to clean the borders." He paused, adjusting the collar of his uniform jacket with a precise, calculated movement. "If the government refuses to take out the trash, the responsibility falls to the patriots," he continued, his tone remaining perfectly conversational. "I spent 30 years patrolling the checkpoints. I know how they cross. I know where they gather to look for under-the-table work. I offer them a ride. False promises of expedited citizenship paperwork, so they climb into the back of the van willingly. They are desperate, trusting animals." He slowly turned his head, looking down at the bound woman weeping on the floor, before turning his gaze back to the camera. "I bring them here," the man stated coldly, "to clear the world of the infection, as only the pure will inherit this land." The man reached down out of the frame, lifting a heavy steel meat cleaver into view, and stood up from the chair. I violently slammed my hand against the power button on the television, killing the video feed before the atrocity could unfold on the screen. I backed away from the desk, my entire body shaking with horror. The scale of the violence was completely incomprehensible. From his uniform, I thought the man was a retired immigration or border enforcement officer. I frantically began searching the wooden desk, pulling open the heavy drawers, desperate to find any identifying information. Inside the bottom drawer, resting on a bed of velvet, was a wooden shadow box. The box contained the retired officer's official law enforcement badges, numerous commendation medals, and an engraved brass plaque detailing his 30 years of service to the Border Enforcement Agency. Tucked neatly beneath the brass plaque was a recent utility bill. The document bore the man's full legal name and a residential address located in a manicured suburban neighborhood on the western edge of the city. I memorized the address, shoving the utility bill deep into my pocket. I needed to call the federal authorities, so I got my phone and called the police, but then all I heard on the other side was the clicking sound. I turned away from the desk, reaching for my tire iron. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling violently flickered and shattered, plunging the cinderblock room into darkness. The temperature in the room aggressively plummeted, turning my exhaled breath into a white vapor. From the cavernous darkness of the main processing floor outside the open door, a sharp, wet sound echoed loudly against the concrete. Click, click, click. The thing had found me. The rapid sound of wet tissue and scraping stones multiplied rapidly, echoing off the rusted meat hooks and the high ceiling. The creature was moving across the processing floor, dragging its massive, shifting bulk toward the hidden room. I grabbed the tire iron, engaged the flashlight on my phone, and sprinted out of the cinderblock room. I aimed the beam across the vast floor. Dropping aggressively down from the high rusted rails above was the entity. The massive amalgamation of bruised, severed limbs hit the floor with a sickening thud. The copper telephone wires binding the flesh whipped violently through the air, striking the metal pillars and sending sparks showering across the room. Dozens of jagged mouths opened simultaneously, producing a deafening, overlapping roar of the clicking dialect. The creature pulled its shifting mass forward, moving with a terrifying speed, blocking the main corridor leading back to the loading dock. I sprinted in the opposite direction, tearing wildly through the maze of lockers. The creature pursued me relentlessly, tearing down rusted shelving units and smashing through the rubber doors. I navigated the dark, labyrinthine plant purely on adrenaline, utilizing the narrow gaps between the heavy machinery to slow the massive bulk of the creature. I heard the snapping of bone and the tearing of wet flesh as it forcefully squeezed its shifting mass through the tight corridors, completely determined to maintain the connection it had established over the phone. I breached the final processing room, diving frantically under a rusted steel sorting gate just as a thick loop of copper wire whipped aggressively through the air, entirely shattering the concrete wall directly behind my head. I scrambled to my feet, burst through the side pedestrian door, and threw myself out into the cold night air of the alleyway. I ran to my car, practically tearing the door handle off, and threw myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the transmission into gear and tore out of the place, my chest heaving violently as I watched the dark silhouette of the meatpacking plant fade in the rearview mirror. I parked my car in a brightly lit parking lot miles away from the plant, locking the doors and staring blankly at the steering wheel. I was safe for the moment, but the fundamental reality of the situation remained. Calling the federal authorities to arrest the retired officer would not save my life. The authorities could lock the killer in a concrete cell, but they could not arrest the creature. The creature was entirely bound to me. It seemed so, and it would relentlessly hunt me down wherever I went until it finished tearing me apart with those copper wires. A desperate, highly dangerous plan rapidly formed in my mind. If the creature targeted the person on the other end of the line, I simply needed to manipulate the connection. I drove my car across the city, navigating away from that part of the city and entering the quiet, perfectly manicured streets of the western suburbs. I parked 2 blocks away from the residential address printed on the utility bill. The neighborhood was completely silent, the large homes sitting comfortably behind perfectly trimmed hedges and expensive wrought iron fences. I walked quietly down the sidewalk until I found the correct house. It was a pristine 2-story brick home featuring a manicured front lawn and a large bay window. The lights on the ground floor were actively burning, cutting brightly through the dark night. I approached the front porch, took a deep, steadying breath to calm my racing heart, and rang the doorbell. I waited for nearly a minute before the oak door slowly opened. Standing in the entryway, wearing comfortable casual clothes, was the man from the videotape. His face lined with deep wrinkles, but the cold, emotionless eyes were entirely identical to the monster I had watched on the screen. "Can I help you?" the officer asked. his deep voice carrying a note of polite irritation. "It is incredibly late." "I apologize for the intrusion, sir," I replied smoothly, projecting my most professional, authoritative dispatch voice. "I am a supervisor with the municipal utility company. We are currently tracking a massive, localized surge in the underground copper telephone lines routing through this specific block. It is creating a severe fire hazard. I need to briefly inspect the primary connection junction inside your home to ensure the wiring is stable." The man frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he evaluated my appearance. I was wearing my dark, unmarked dispatch uniform, which closely resembled standard utility workwear. "I have not experienced any issues with my landline," he stated suspiciously. "The surge is silent, sir," I countered, maintaining eye contact. "If the copper wiring in your walls overheats, the insulation will ignite entirely within the drywall. The inspection will take less than 2 minutes. If you prefer to refuse access, I will simply document the refusal and dispatch the fire marshal to cut the power to your property from the street." The threat of municipal inconvenience easily bypassed his strict paranoia. He sighed heavily, stepping back and pulling the door open. "Make it quick," he ordered, gesturing toward the interior. "The main junction box is located in the utility closet down the hall, just past the guest bathroom." "Thank you, sir," I said, stepping over the threshold and walking into the pristine, heavily decorated home. I walked down the hallway, highly aware of the killer standing near the front door behind me. I opened the door to the small utility closet and stepped inside. I closed the door entirely, leaving myself in the cramped, dark space. After a moment, I went out and spotted a cordless landline receiver resting in its charging cradle on a small wooden table just outside the utility closet. I picked up the plastic handset, pressed the green connection button to open the channel, and brought the speaker to my ear. A heavy, suffocating static hissed through the tiny speaker, followed immediately by a sharp, wet sound. Click, click, click. I carefully set the receiver down on the flat surface of the wooden table. I closed the utility closet door and walked back down the hallway to the entryway. The officer was waiting impatiently by the front door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "The junction is experiencing a severe frequency loop," I informed him, offering a polite, practiced nod while gesturing back down the hall. "I need to run a remote diagnostic trace from the main municipal hub tonight to ensure the wiring does not overheat. I have left your landline receiver off the hook to maintain the active signal. You must leave that line completely open until tomorrow morning so our technicians can continuously test the copper integrity. Do not hang up that phone under any circumstances. Just make sure the gate is closed on your way out," the killer muttered, glancing briefly with annoyance toward the open receiver on the table before pulling the front door wide and ushering me out onto the porch. I walked down the steps and down the sidewalk. I maintained a calm, steady pace until I rounded the corner and reached my parked car. I drove away from the suburbs, heading back toward the safety of my own apartment. I spent the entire night sitting awake on my sofa, staring at the walls, listening intently for the sound of wet flesh and scraping stones. The apartment remained completely silent. The following morning, I turned on the local news station while I drank my coffee. The lead anchor appeared on the screen, his expression somber as he reported breaking news from the western suburbs. The authorities had discovered the body of a retired, highly decorated border enforcement official inside his home early this morning. The anchor stated that the scene was incredibly chaotic and violent, completely baffling the forensic teams. The official cause of death was currently withheld from the public, but anonymous sources within the precinct indicated the victim had been brutally mangled, his limbs heavily lacerated and violently bound together by hundreds of yards of thick, rusted copper telephone wire. I turned the television off and set my coffee mug down on the table. I am posting this detailed account here today to document the events of the last 48 hours. I returned to the dispatch center for my shift tonight. The sticky note is still sitting in the trash can under my desk. I firmly believe the entity has finally left me alone. It followed the signal, It found the monster responsible for the atrocities in the meatpacking plant, and it extracted its terrible revenge, so the connection has been permanently severed. I just desperately hope the phone on my desk never clicks again. Around 99% viewers watching my videos still haven't subscribed, so if you enjoy the videos, make sure to subscribe and join the community.